Hello everyone, welcome to the next lecture of our Architecture and City lecture series. This one is called Compact City, Density, Mixed Use and Participation. In this lecture we will deal a lot with the ideas of Patrick Geddes and his theory of conservative surgery, which has been inspirational for cities until today. And also Seoul has taken some clues from the ideas and the practice of Patrick Geddes. So, to start off, this is an image of Patrick Geddes. And Patrick Geddes, interestingly, has not been trained as an architect or an urban planner. Patrick Geddes has been trained as a biologist, a botanist. Mm. And at some point in his career, he had trouble with his eyes. There was a medical condition through which his eyesight got worse and worse, which at some point went so bad that he couldn't use the microscope anymore. And he had to look for different way to practice. And at the time when he was active, the idea of evolution has just been discovered, and yeah, he was following these kind of ideas and trying to study that in biology. But once his eyesight disappeared, he needed to change subject. So he started concentrating on cities. He was increasingly interested in cities and those processes taking place there. So in a way, you can say that he used the theories of survival of the fittest, biological theories of growth, um, biological theories of growth to analyze cities and also to work with them. So he became interested in tenement housing and the whole problem of overcrowding and the creation of slums and what to do about it. So one of the first things he did was, which was new from a urban planning and urban design perspective, is to look at a city within its wider context. So that means not only the city itself, but how it's integrated into into the context. So that means what kind of ecology is around, what kind of natural landscape do you have there, what kind of resources can you find in the vicinity, because it's all connected, right? If you have a certain type of soil, then you will have a certain type of plants that grow there. With these plants, you can create a certain type of industry. You can grow a certain type of food, manufacture it, make bread, and so on. There's a whole kind of line of production that is dependent on those locational aspects where the city is situated, that today we know as the field of urban and regional studies. So he's looking at it in the very big picture, let's say not only the city, but the city within the region. That's the frame that he's looking at. And yeah, here you see some examples of studies that he made. So he's looking for these kind of relations, right? How does overcrowding and underhousing come about? Why do rents rise extremely high, and where do high land values come from? So then he figures out with a traditional city that you have in England that there's this city wall that constrains the growth of the city. And with industrialization, modernization, people move to the city, as we know, in this rapid urbanization process starting off. But once you have these fixed extensions with the city wall, then the city cannot grow anymore. and the land inside the boundaries of the city was becoming so scarce that the land values rise tremendously, and with it also the rents. Um, so these kind of processes he was interested in, and there you can see how kind of the physical design is linked to yeah, the kind of social processes and economic processes. This is an image of Merce. So this is a collaborator of his. With him, he made these 3D sketches, sections, analytic sketches, and yeah, collaborated in these studies. Some more of these sketches. So his frame of analysis varies quite a lot. So on the one hand, you see how he's studying how this city is behaving within the context of the bigger landscape or the region, if you want. But then he's also looking at projects like these backsides in Edinburgh, and how to make them flourish again, reorganize, and green them again. So I guess you can say that one of the main features of his work is to be very context specific and not so much scale specific. Context is extremely important, and to work with the context rather than a fixed idea that is superimposed on an existing context. So if you remember from one of our first lectures, that I made this division between urban thinkers, where on the one hand we had the ones that are proposing that urban planning and urban design should be done by well-trained smart individuals that get a lot of power, because these specialists can make better decisions for the people than the people themselves. That is the one group, right? In the last lecture, Le Corbusier is clearly one of those people that believes in the power and authority of well-trained individuals. And then on the other hand, with people like Ebenezer Howard from the Guardian Cities, and also Patrick Geddes, who think more about the planning of cities as a collaborative process and something that is growing from within, in which the local context or the collaboration among the people that actually live in a city is important. So this just to keep in mind, and then from there go to the next slide. So what he's proposing, and that is also quite similar to Ebenezer Howard and the idea of the Guardian City, is that one should improve cities or part of cities without the use of the state. One shouldn't rely on the state or the government to do it for you or to give you the money to do it, but instead to be kind of proactive and organize something which is within the reach of what you can affect or what you can change. So there's a group of people at the time that were interested in these kind of ideas and carrying out projects that were working for the social good, if you want, but not funded by the government or steered by the government. So in that sense, independent. And then we get to the next slide, which introduces Geddes' ideas of conservative surgery. And you see this up here. This title you've probably seen somewhere as a bumper sticker or a t-shirt. This is a quote from Patrick Geddes: "Think globally, act locally." So the global problems, big problems or issues need to be tackled, but the way to come to terms with these problems or issues at hand is not to just demolish everything and roll out something new, but to make incidental small changes to the existing in order to make the existing system function better. So this term, conservative surgery, is quite literal. So on the one hand you have the term conservative, so that means to conserve, to keep something, and surgery, you know, like a doctor performs surgery. It's a very precise act of, yeah, of an operation. So if you have something wrong with, I don't know, with your body, then a good surgeon would go in there, analyze very sharply, and only take out the part of the fabric that is not well, and leave the rest intact. Right. So he's proposing something similar for cities, and that you can see here. So this is a rehabilitation plan that he made for an Indian city, and here you see the old existing urban fabric underneath, and then you see this gridiron projected on top. So that is what planners that were planning in a top-down way proposed to do with that part of the urban fabric. Instead, Geddes said, okay, we shouldn't like just demolish everything and put this new grid on top, because that's very inefficient, it's very expensive, and probably a lot of people will need to be evicted, and they won't have a chance to come back once the new development is finished. You destroy local economy, you destroy maybe social ties. So it's a very brutal way of tackling the problem. So instead what he is proposing is to carefully study the context, and then he came up with this legend that shows which part of the urban fabric, which house needs to be acquired, needs to be bought, and which can stay the way it is. And then through these incidental, small, surgery-like changes, you can actually change the existing context in a desired way without having to demolish everything and all those consequences that come with it. So here's another example of the conservative surgery. Yeah, here you see urban fabric, extremely small scale, and extremely dense, hardly any public space, hardly any quality space. And as you can see here, it's a combination of combining lots, but also taking incidental lots out to create more space, more air, and also more public activity, which then ends up to be this type of urban fabric, which also has more green, more openness in it. Yeah, this is another example of the same thing. Again, you see existing urban fabric in this brownish gray. It's overlaid what top-down planning authorities were proposing, and instead of this kind of gridiron plan, he is making this very delicate analysis of the different qualities that you have there, and then proposes incidental demolition or redevelopment and improvements to the public space to end up with this new urban fabric. So today it's called urban rehabilitation, and we will also see that this has some reference to Seoul, where this kind of strategy now has been taken over since Mayor Park has tried to diminish the old new town redevelopment projects. But we'll see that in a little bit. So another example from India. So as you know, the British were the colonial power in India, and Indian cities were notoriously in bad state. One of the main problems um, for the spreading of the diseases and the dirtiness was the lack of good wastewater and sewage system. So then, for example, here in Berhampur, beginning of the 20th century, the British tried to impose a new city development in which they had high ambitions. So here, every house should have their own toilet. So, of course, this is a good ambition, and when carrying this out, this would help the city tremendously. But what Geddes would criticize about this type of planning would be that it's not really feasible to carry this out for the entire city, right? So now what you could do is that you have part of the city, maybe a neighborhood or a bit more than that, that is built impeccable with all the kind of standard of living as you have it in England at the time. But then you wouldn't be able to afford to improve the living standards also in the rest of the city. So somehow it becomes very selective, right? And what he points out is that just the choice to build this water flushed latrine would cost as much, if you combine it with all the costs for the infrastructure, as the rest of the house. So that he would call absurd. So instead, what he's proposing, I'll show you in a second what he's proposing. But what was the result of this is that once this has been carried out here in this area, this looks like could be in England, right? But then on the other side, you still have the informal city that has been growing wildly with all the problems of overcrowding, sanitary problems, and so on. So in a way, you don't really fix the problem. Generally, you only fix it like incidental and locally. And what Geddes is looking for is a system that could help everyone despite the lack of funds, despite the lack of money that the government has to implement it. And this is his idea that I was introducing earlier. So what he's saying is that one should look at the way that the people live, the local economy, the occupations of the people, customs, history, and so on. And what he came up with is an idea to try to clean the city without having to build this tremendously expensive sewage system with all these latrines in every house. So he's referring back to the occupation of the street sweepers that you would have in India, which could, next to sweeping the streets, also be the persons that collect the feces from the houses. And then you can use this outside in the countryside to fertilize the soil. And then you get a kind of ecosystem, right, where the feces helps again to grow new agricultural products that can be sold again in the city. And yeah, this becomes an ecosystem that benefits a lot of people only in a small way, but could potentially be used as a system for the whole city. So much more of a low-tech approach that tries to make use of the existing qualities of the culture, existing economy, and so on. Yeah, here another example of rehabilitation, Bazaar in Baharampur. I'm just going to go through this quickly because we know the way he's doing that. So good assessment of the site, and then incidental redevelopment or replacement, or incidental surgical removement of buildings to come up with a new plan. And this leads to urban rehabilitation plans that are much more connected to the local culture. This is him with some of his students in India. And the whole exercise has something to do with trying to find beauty in the existing structures, existing culture, even though not everything is perfect and shiny. Right? It's a different way of appreciating what is there, and it's looking for a different kind of beauty, if you want. Yeah, so what he's saying is that this approach would be cheaper. You could help more people, even though you help everybody only a little bit. You could help more people, and it would be cheaper, and in the end would improve the living conditions of everybody. There would be less sickness and less death rates. Yeah, this just as a kind of reminder how this process works. And then from here, I think we should go to Seoul. Right, next one is a new planning method for Seoul, which in fact has been around since the beginning of the 20th century. So this idea of urban rehabilitation is already more than 100 years old, but nevertheless still used. So here, this is an example of urban rehabilitation in Insadong. So everybody knows Insadong, I suppose. Gyeongbokgung over here, and there's the main street, the pedestrian street going down here, and this then should be extended into this area. The original plan is what you can see here with the blue and the red outlines, and existing fabric is what you see underneath. So existing urban fabric is very small scale. Lots of traditional houses, probably hanoks, and other old houses. Urban grain is very small, very densely built, and then you have only small narrow alleys. Sorry, not only, but you have a lot of small narrow alleys that are just like walkable, and then few streets that can be used by car. What the new plan was proposing is to combine these lots and then redevelop them with big buildings. So that's what you can see here. The blue ones are the ones that have been already carried out or under construction at the time, and the red ones are the ones that are planned but have been stopped by City Hall in order to try a different approach. So this is then urban rehabilitation. So what they did instead is that they defined a planning area. So essentially this is what was left, what has not yet been developed. And similar to what Geddes has been doing, they looked at the qualities of the existing, or tried to find qualities of the existing. So for example, the narrow alleys with all the small restaurants and cafes there, which looks quite messy and not beautiful in the traditional sense, but then on the other hand it's very original and in a way sympathetic. So when I, for example, have friends coming over from Europe, I always take them to these areas, and people are always impressed with this, right? We don't have that in Europe, and these kind of small spaces are often so lively and active, and it kind of confirms a little bit the maybe romantic idea of Asian cities that are like busy and full. Yeah, which is an experience that you can find here. So it also makes us, makes sense to have such a strategy in an area like Insadong, where a lot of tourists come. But of course, it could happen in other places as well. So how they describe this project, they don't directly relate to Patrick Geddes, but the steps they are taking in this process are very similar, right? So it's a slow progress, slow process. They call it clouded redevelopment project, consisting of a lot of like small particles. Yeah, they want to maintain the traditional image, and they want to preserve historical urban context, and only improve it incidentally. This is one of the presentation slides from the city of Seoul. You don't have to remember this in detail. What I think is interesting here is that you have the public, so that's city of Seoul, and then you have some specialists that help with the redevelopment program, but then you also have the residents that have been given a role in the process, and they have an equal role. Question is how this carries out in the actual process, but as an ambition, there are 3 equal roles divided, and there's the idea of like collaborative redevelopment. Here some presentation slide also from the city, where they show those meetings with the individual residents, how they are drafting ideas together, and really try to implement this as a collaborative process, and also as a way to understand the area much better. So if you don't understand an area, it's always very easy to just see the bad sides and see what's not working, and come up with a strategy that simply destroys a lot and tries to implement new things. But if you really want, you have to take the time and go into that process of talking, collaborating, listening to what the residents want, and follow a much slower redevelopment process, and include opinions and from the residents. So this is what they came up with. Different type of zoning, right? They decided what part of the urban fabric to keep, what kind of zoning is where, how to improve the infrastructure, what characteristics to preserve, what kind of identity to preserve, and also what kind of industry to stimulate, or what kind of local business they want to support. So actually, it's not only about the urban fabric, it's also about the people that work there or live there, how we can provide them with a new or maintain their way of living, even though the area is changing. Yeah, and that's what you see here. This is the old plan, and that is the new plan. So much more diverse and small scale. And then, yeah, this is another image going back to Patrick Geddes and ideas for India. So this is more to be complete. So Patrick Geddes did not only make plans for urban rehabilitation, but he would also make plans for like layout of new developments of entire like quarters of a town, as you can see here, where it's much more traditional, right, with a kind of perimeter block, front yard, backyard idea. So this type of planning he would do as well. Another image of another project of his, I think I'll just go through and introduce what he calls the cooperative tenant principle. So here you can see the kind of universal approach of Geddes. He's not only thinking about the space, how to improve the space, but also how to maintain the culture, how to maintain the local economy, local businesses, and work with the people of that area in the redevelopment process. So he proposes this cooperative tenant principle. So what that means is basically that the residents, the tenants of an area, collaborate with the federal government, or could also be the local government, could also be the city, and they get money from the city. Maybe it's a loan or maybe it's a backing of loan. It doesn't matter so much. So somehow, with the help of the government, they have access to capital. They get a loan, and with this, they can build houses or renovate existing houses and improve their welfare. They can improve their lifestyle. They can build the types of services that they need, the kind of leisure activities that they need. So they can basically get closer to the life that they would wish they could live with this loan. And then once the project is done and operational, then there are rents coming and loan repayments coming back to the cooperative. And that cooperative can pay off loans. And this is, in fact, similar to the idea of Howard and the Garden Cities. There was also the idea of taking a loan, right, developing the Garden City, and then using the money that comes back from rents and loan repayments to create some kind of welfare. So here you can see that at some point maybe the loan is paid back, and then at some point dividends, well, yeah, money can be paid to the tenants and the shareholders, or that could be saved up and work as a pension fund for old age and provide some kind of welfare that these people would otherwise not have, because there is no welfare system in India that would provide a pension or something like this. And one of the main points here is that the residents set up this system together with the government in order to help themselves. And there's no commercial profit-making interest involved. So developers normally just want to get into a project, build, get the money, leave, right? Invest it somewhere else or put it in their pocket. But it's all about like making quick money, and here it's a much longer perspective. And as the people that are living there are helping themselves, they are, they are happy with lower profits, simply because they improve their way of life. Yeah, this is image of Ealing. Maybe you remember also from the Guardian Cities lecture. This is a plan made for Garden City in London, which has also used this cooperative tenant principle. You remember that in these estates there would be leisure facilities offered to the people that live there that otherwise people couldn't afford just on their own, right? If you remember, there were these commonly used courtyards where they could have tennis courts or swimming pools or these kind of things that people of the lower middle class or workers wouldn't be able to afford just by themselves. This one I see is a mistake, so forget about this text. This is kind of just a reminder of a previous lecture where already people use this cooperative tenant principle to help themselves. And then this has been architecture movement in the 60s that has been very explorative, experimental. You've probably heard of Archigram, Archizoom, who were exploring like new ways of living and also new ways of individualistic living. So here you can see ideas coming back of people living in communities and self-organized communities. The architecture just becomes like a big framework that gets filled in by these people by themselves. Yeah, fantastic and fun projects to study if you're interested in this kind of architecture. Yeah, using of pods and the whole idea of repetition. Then in the 60s, another project that is interesting to study is also using the idea of framework, right? And this big framework kind of industrial infrastructure can get flexibly filled in. This is Fun Palace from Cedric Price, a classic project. Yeah, and also much closer to us, metabolist movement in Japan, also using the idea of repetition communities. And even though here the idea is not that these architecture structures grow, but still the design is based on an idea of growth and repetition that has something organic to it. Another impression of Kenzo Tanga, Tokyo Bay project. You can find the same principles, right? So there's again big infrastructure on these roads and bridges, and then you have these piers on which you have these floating houses that emerge there individually, spontaneously, and in that sense become kind of a growing structure, where this, if you close your eyes a little bit, you can imagine this like tree with these leaves growing on there. So there's an evidence of that idea of growth and kind of organic liveliness in the structure. Okay, thank you. This is first part, and then I will come back to you with the second part where we talk more about other examples of this kind of self-organizing architecture. Thank you.